Hello everyone, my name is John and this is The Single Truth. Here at The Single Truth, that is what we're all about, getting the true Word of God out to the masses in hopes that it will change lives for the better, which in turn may change the world for the better. Have you ever asked yourself the question, can God use me? And if so, will He use me? Well, this is going to be a two-part episode. This week in part one, we're going to answer the question of, can God use you? And next week, we will tackle the question, will God use you? Back in the mid-1990s, I believe it was somewhere around 94 or 95, I lived in Oklahoma at the time, and that's when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. So there was a local church that would do on Friday nights this thing. A youth pastor at this local church would do a thing that would just bring people together. He would preach the word, and then we'd have pizza afterwards and fellowship and just talk and hang out for a little bit. Now, their church had got damaged in the Oklahoma City bombing, so they were using a different church. And that's where the story I'm about to tell you happened. Now, this is kind of an old-timey church where they had the pews, not modern-day seats, but the long wooden benches that you could sit on. So on this particular night, this preacher was preaching about Moses, at his burning bush encounter when God was talking to Moses out of the burning bush. So he's sitting here telling the story of Moses, and Moses coming up with all these lame excuses of why God shouldn't use him. So as he's preaching, I hear this. At the moment, I thought it was an audible voice. I thought it was somebody messing with me, and I heard this voice say, "I want you to preach my word." And it was so loud, like clear, like right now, that I kind of turned around to see if somebody was messing with me. Well, the nearest people behind me was probably, 15, 20 feet. To the left or right and in front of me, same thing, probably 15, 20 feet. So it was nobody messing with me. And during this whole time, the preacher never missed a beat. People weren't looking around to see what was going on. Again, I thought it was somebody messing with me. Then when I finally realized it was the Holy Spirit talking to my spirit, that voice was meant for me. I want you to preach my word. Now, I'm a slow learner, so I'm sitting there the same excuses I just hear 15 seconds before Moses gave, I'm giving the same one. So I don't know the Bible that well. And I didn't at the time, and I still don't. I still have a whole lot to learn. But I got an answer. Well, read it more. I'm like, all right, well, I don't have money to go to school to do this. That voice says again, it's not a voice, it's just an impression, a feeling. If you've had it, you know what I'm talking about. So again, this voice says, well, I'll take care of that. So I don't know if I have the time to do that. Again, so I can tell as I'm giving these same lame excuses, it finally dawns on me, all right, just shut up and submit to the Lord's command. So I did, but I kind of put it off for a year. And then about a year later, I start getting the pressure. Hey, what did I tell you to do? So I started school. Now, I don't know if it was in one of these videos or on that podcast I told you guys back about a couple of weeks back, but it took me 20 years to get a 4-year degree because when the money was there, the time wasn't. When the time was, the money wasn't, and so on and so forth. So here we are in 2024. And so 30 years later, give or take. So over the last year or so, I'm getting this impression, all right, did the schooling, I've done the, studied the Bible more, so I'm getting this impression to do this YouTube thing. And now here we are on the YouTube thing. And so now, as Paul Harvey would say, you know the rest of the story. God can use anybody no matter what they've done in their past. Now, if you'll recall last week when I did that egg demonstration, I told you the story about that pastor who had wanted me to preach that one particular Sunday when he was going to be away. Now, that pastor, before he became a pastor, was a cocaine addict. So when he finally hit rock bottom, God had his attention, and he turned his life around and over to God, and God has used him in significant ways. That church was small at the time. Now that church has grown to be pretty large, and God used him, a cocaine addict, to do that. Now, there are numerous examples in the Bible of people that God has used. members of society would call them the dregs of society. So God has used those dregs of society to do some significant and powerful things, but it's only through His power that they've been able to accomplish these things. Because if we try to accomplish things God wants us to do in our power, we're going to fail miserably. So it is God who uses these dregs of society to get things done, and at the same time growing these people in a spiritual walk, in a personal relationship with God. So now let's get into the Word of God and see a couple of these examples that God has used the dregs of society. Now we find the story of Rahab over in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. So we're going to read about Rahab here in Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 1 and going through verse 16. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, Go, view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country. So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country. Then the woman took the 2 men and hid them. So she said, Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And it happened, as the gate was being shut, when it was dark, that the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords. And as soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. Now before they lay down, she come up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted, neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore, I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token. And spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. So the men answered her, Our lives for yours. If none of you tell this business of ours, and it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, and she dwelt on the wall. And she said to them, Get to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you. Hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Afterward you may go your way. Now, the rest of the story of that is that they told her, okay, when we come back to overtake the city and overthrow the city, everybody has to be in her house. They told Rahab they need to go to your house and be there. And also, the window that she let them down through there in the story, she was also to put a scarlet cord in that window, so they knew where she lived. And so the camp of Israel, when they come in to overtake that city, the deal was, hey, you see that cord in the window? Don't mess with that house. They're with us. Everything else is going to be destroyed. That's why they made it clear to her, whoever you want to save, mother, brothers, sisters, all them that she talked about, make sure they're in your house, because if they're not in your house, they're fair game. Okay, they're going to be destroyed like everybody else. Now, the people, as you read there in the story, they were afraid of Israel. They'd heard of all those things that God had done, brought them out of Egypt, Pharaoh's army got destroyed and all that, like Rahab was telling them. So this woman had admitted here that, you know, your God is the one true God, is basically what she's saying. Now, Rahab was a harlot, okay? Ladies and gentlemen, that's a whore, okay? And here's what Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, how they define the word whore. A person who engages in sexual intercourse for pay. That was Rahab, okay? She was a harlot. Now, Rahab went on to have a son named Boaz. Boaz married a lady named Ruth. Ruth is another woman that's a key figure in Israel's history. So, Rahab had Boaz. Boaz married a lady named Ruth. Ruth had a son. Ruth and Boaz had a son named Obed. Obed had a son named Jesse. Jesse had a son named David. David was king, the second king anointed in Israel. That's also the same David that slew Goliath. So you got David and Goliath David. Now, if my math was right, Rahab was the 21st great-grandmother of Jesus. Okay, and she was the great-great-grandmother of David. So in the line of Jesus, you have a harlot. Okay, and now we're going to talk about King David as the next example to see what kind of dreg he was according to society. But in God's eyes, he wasn't a dreg. So let's get into the story of David. Now, as I said, Rahab was David's great-great-grandmother. And another thing about Rahab, before we actually get into David, is that Rahab, over in chapter 11 of Hebrews, that's known as the Faith Hall of Fame chapter. It names a bunch of people there that has had great faith in the past. And so Rahab is only one of two women inducted, if you will, into the Faith Hall of Fame by God. Sarah was the other one. So Rahab, the harlot, is inducted by God into the Faith Hall of Fame. Now, that's an accomplishment. So now her great-great-grandson, David, he was the youngest of Jesse's sons. Okay? And he was a shepherd boy. He would be out in the fields, tending to the sheep while his brothers were out fighting. They were soldiers fighting for Israel in wars with King Saul as the king, first king of Israel. So they're all fighting with King Saul, and David's the youngest. He's tending the sheep. Now, David was anointed king by the prophet Samuel, but it was about 15 years later before he actually became king. So during that 15 years, he was still being a shepherd boy, and he had a job tending to Saul and some of his stuff, like his cupbearer, and he played harp for him and stuff like this. So he wasn't made king as soon as he was anointed, about 15 years later, like I said. But during that time, David done a couple of good things, but then on the backside, he did some pretty lousy things. A dreg kind of thing, people would say. So now one day, his brothers, the Israelites, are fighting the Philistines. Okay, and so David's father, Jesse, tells him, hey, take some food to your brothers up on the front lines, bread, milk, cheese, that kind of stuff. So David takes the stuff and he goes up to the front lines where the fighting's going on. And they're fighting these Philistines, right? So now here's where Goliath comes in. Goliath was like this big, tall giant, like over 9 foot tall. And so Goliath is mocking the Israelites, saying, oh, why don't you come out and fight us, But everybody's scared. They don't want to fight this dude. So they come up with a plan and say, all right, here's what we'll do. Israel, you send your greatest warrior over. We'll send our greatest warrior, Goliath. Instead of everybody dying, we'll let them two fight. Whoever wins that, they're declared the winner, and the other side loses. So they're like, all right. So David comes up on the scene at this moment in the story. And he brings the food, and he's like, oh, what's going on here, guys? And they're saying, oh, well, what are you doing here, little shepherd boy? Just go back home. This doesn't concern you. This is man stuff. And so David says, well, what's going on? And they said, well, we got to fight Goliath, and we're scared. And David's like, what, this Philistine? We're afraid of this Philistine? We have the power of God. We're afraid of this dude. And so, long story short, David says, all right, I'll fight him. So they first try to put Saul's armor on David, and it's just too heavy for him. He's just walking around all, stumbling. He just can't handle it. The weight's too much for him. So he takes that off. And now, in the meantime, Goliath is still mocking these people. So David says, all right, I got this. So he picks up 5 smooth stones. He starts walking out on the battlefield, and Goliath's making fun of you. You're sending me this puny little dude. Here I am. I'm a man's man. I'm a soldier. You're sending me this little runt. Well, David gets to slinging that sling around with one of them stones. It right between the eyes. It hits Goliath. He goes down, chops Goliath's head off, holds it up. All the Philistines starts running like cockroaches when the lights come on. So, God had used David, because David's this little puny thing. God had used this little runt, dreg of society to get something accomplished. Now, let's fast forward in David's life. He's king now. They've been fighting wars and whatnot, so all his soldiers are out on the front lines fighting where he should have been with them, but this one particular time, he wasn't. He's at home, so he walks out on his deck one night. Well, he's kind of looking down in the city, and he sees this woman come out onto her balcony to take a bath. So he sees this naked woman there. He's like, oh, wow, So he sends for her to see who it is. Well, it's Uriah's wife. Uriah is one of his best generals. So David summons her. He has his way with her. Everything's fine in his eyes. A little bit later, she comes back and says, oh, I'm pregnant. Oh, well, now David's, it's really hitting the fan now. He's like, oh, what do I do? People will know that it was me that got her pregnant. So he comes up with this plan. He says, I'll have Uriah come home from the front lines, tell him, go spend some time with the wife in the hopes that he's going to, do the nasty with her. And then they'll say, oh, well, he got her pregnant. So, well, Uriah comes, talks to the king. King says, yeah, why don't you just go home and, spend some time with your wife. You've been fighting some battles. You deserve a break. Well, Uriah not only was one of his best generals, he's also a loyal soldier as well. And he says, no, I can't do that because my men are out on the front lines. They're getting rocks and stones thrown at them. And now I'm supposed to come home and have pleasure? No, I can't do that. That wouldn't be right. So he didn't do it. So then David's like, man, what do I do now? So now David comes up with this plan. One of his other generals, he says, all right, let's do this. I want you to go fight the fiercest battle you can find. I want you to put Uriah on the front line when the battle's getting really hot and heavy, and I want you to pull back to keep from protecting him. So that's exactly what happens. They get into a battle. Uriah goes up. They pull back. Uriah dies in battle. Now, David does a little bit of a good thing here. He takes Uriah's wife and he marries her. So now that she's pregnant, well, okay, that's okay because now it's the king's wife. So he was a conniver. First of all, he committed adultery. All right. Second of all, he tried to have this guy be deceptive towards him, have the guy sleep with his wife to cover up his misgivings. And then third, when that didn't work, he had the guy murdered. So he's an adulterer, a schemer, and a murderer. And yet God calls David a man after his own heart. Speaking of God's own heart. And we'll find that in 1 Samuel 13:14. I want to read that just a little bit. So in Samuel 13:14, Samuel's talking to Saul, and he says, and Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not continue. Because Saul did some disobedience things back there, so that's why he lost favor with God. So the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. He's talking about David. And the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people because you have not kept what the Lord has commanded you. So right there, God's calling David a man after his own heart. Over in Acts chapter 13, verse 22, it says this about David. And he went and had, talking about God here, and when God, had removed him, talking about Saul, what we just read, God raised up for them David as king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all of my will. So, does that mean God likes adultery and likes conniving and murder? No. But what he's saying is when David found out about all these bad things he did, when it was pointed out to him, he repented, he admitted, I did wrong. He repented of those sins and he asked for forgiveness. That's the man after his own heart is what God is talking about here. So here we have two dregs of society that people would say, oh, why would he use them? And yet he uses a harlot and he uses a murderer, an adulterer, and a schemer to get his things done. But only through God's power can that happen. Two dregs of society, and yet God used them. Now you may be thinking to yourself, yeah, but those were Bible people, so God knew what was going to happen, when he used them. Well, true, he did, because he is omniscient. He knows everything. But they didn't know what was going to happen. So you can't sit there and say, well, my life's messed up, and I'll just wait till it gets straight, then I'll see if if he'll use me? Well, number one, your life's not going to be straight apart from him. And number two, don't wait to see if he's going to use you. Start asking now. And that's how you do that. You go through prayer to see how he can use you. You get into the Word to see how he can use you. The best thing, though, is to pray. Lord, how can you use me? Now, he may use you in ways you don't expect. He may use you in ways that you would not necessarily like. If you had your choice of how he would use you, you may come up with something a little more, pleasant, let's say. But it doesn't matter. He will use you in the way he knows best, and it will be the best way after all. I mean, he used a harlot in Rahab, and then he used an adulterer and a murderer and a schemer in David. So now the question remains after that is, can he use you? Yes, he can. The question now is, will he use you? And that's what we will tackle next week. We just read about 2 of many biblical examples of how God used the dregs of society and used them in powerful ways. Now, it's not only to bring glory and honor to him, but it's to teach us some things along the way. Things that make us grow in a better understanding of him and a better knowledge of him, and things that actually, when we do grow in him, it teaches us to trust him more and to rely on him more. And he can and will use us to get those things accomplished in powerful ways. But it's only through his power that those things get accomplished, not our power, because we can't do it in our own power. So he wants to use us, and he can use us in those powerful ways, working through us, and at the same time working on us to get those things accomplished.